I think we should not do it.
Great point, Chris. Really, really helpful. It's nice that our listeners got a really good, concise summary and a nice take-home message. So well done for that. Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am by Game of Thrones.
Oh, come on.
Do you guys watch?
How can you possibly be confused by that?
Oh, I don't understand. What's the obsession?
Well, it's all about violence and sex. It's very popular, apparently.
Yeah, dragons. I mean, who doesn't want a dragon?
Right, and fire and mutants. It's
Okay,
like,
so in my notes I wrote, as confused as I am by Game of Thrones, and then my next line is, Chris, do you want to say anything inappropriate that we're going to have to cut out?
No, I don't need to do that. But I do understand that the collective works of George H.R.R. Morrow are extremely complicated for the lay consumer of fantasy violence.
There's a lot of plot lines in there.
There's a lot of plot lines in there. And so it turns out that there's this awesome website that you can go to that will explain everything you need to know about Game of Thrones, which is called the Population Health Exchange.
Really? Oh, that's fantastic.
Yes. And I didn't realize this, but Leslie Talalian is one of the number one fans.
Wow. What else can you learn there?
You wouldn't believe what you can learn.
Can you learn things about... Is it in addition to
Avengers?
that also a hub for lifelong learning?
10 Avengers movies. There are a lot of what
Public health?
No, not so much lifelong learning, but it is a source of all sorts of information about trivia.
I don't think you're going to find that there, but I do think you'll find public health learning programs and tools. Anyway, so I am here with I'm Matt Fox, and I am here with Chris Gill and Don Thea.
In spirit.
Here's London for you.
Well, I'm here on the microphone with you both, and we're all from the Boston University School of Public Health. And let's get into today's show. So today, in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to look at the relationship between cannabis use and psychotic disorders. And then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we are going to talk about something I had never heard of before, something called ethics dumping. And then in our Amazing and Amusing, we'll get into some things that make us laugh out loud, or Chris will tell us whether or not cats do indeed know their names.
They do.
He did that last time.
I know. That was my point.
We're going to talk about naked mole rats today.
Something like that. Yeah, Chris has forewarned us. We're going to be talking about naked mole rats, and Nick is ready with the edit functions in advance. So
there's nothing obscene about the beauty of a naked mole rat. It is just the natural way of things.
Let's move on. So segment 1, we are going to talk about an article that looked at the relationship between cannabis use and psychotic disorders, published in Lancet Psychiatry. The study was titled "The Contribution of Cannabis Use to Variation in the Incidence of Psychotic Disorder Across Europe," EUGEI, I think that's the abbreviation for the study acronym, a multi-center case control study by Marta DeForti of the Social, Genetic, and Developmental Psychiatry Department at King's College London, where I should say I am not now, but I did spend a year as an undergraduate. So here are some of the headlines for this one. Daily marijuana use linked with higher risk of psychosis, says a study. That was from the New York Post. The Chicago Sun-Times says smoking high-potency marijuana daily raises risk of psychosis, study says. Esquire says smoking weed daily could cause psychosis. The Guardian says, can we all chill out about cannabis? Not quite yet. Now, that is an opinion piece. That was not a news story. And then The Hill says, will smoking cannabis make you psychotic? ? Not likely. So those are all over the spectrum.
That was a pretty good summary.
Yeah, they seem to have gotten a lot of different things out of this study. So Don, let's have you start off by giving us the 411 on this study.
These authors sought to look at the association between a first episode of psychosis and marijuana use in a bunch of different circumstances, using this 5-year study that Matt referred to called the EUGEI study, which was a study that was intended to look at the genetic, clinical, and environmental determinants of psychosis during the years of 2005 to 2010. It was located in 17 sites in England, France, Netherlands, Italy, and Spain. And they found that among those sites, during that period of time, there was about an 8-fold difference in the incidence of first psychosis. And so they were interested in diving a little bit deeper and trying to see if there were specific determinants that they could identify, and specifically the use of cannabis, and to what extent that contributed to it. So the aims of the study were to describe the differences in patterns of cannabis use across the sites, to identify a measure of cannabis use with the strongest impact on the odds of psychotic disorder across sites, calculate the population attributable fraction for the specific use patterns associated with the highest association with cannabis use, and to test whether the differences in patterns of cannabis use contribute to variations in the incidence of the psychotic disorder. So what they did is they enrolled individuals between the ages of 18 and 64 years old who manifested their first episode of psychosis that presented to these 17 sites, which had clinical teams. People were excluded if they were previously treated for psychosis, or if there was an organic component to their psychosis, including intoxication or dementia or stroke or infectious disease or epilepsy. There are other causes of psychosis which they excluded. So they were just looking at the first onset of psychosis in individuals without an otherwise clear explanation for it. So in addition to enrolling the people that presented to the clinical teams, they sought to balance out some of those individuals or some of those groups, like young men, that were underrepresented. And to do that, they used the internet and newspaper advertisements and flyers. And in all of those ways in which they were seeking additional enrollees, they never mentioned the use of cannabis. So people would be enrolled in this study as controls, or as people who answered these advertisements without knowing that that was the underlying reason for the enrollment. And they looked at socioeconomic status. They applied to every individual a modified cannabis experience questionnaire. They called it a CEQ. They looked at 6 measures of cannabis use: lifetime use, current use, age at first use, frequency of use, and the amount of money spent per week during the most consistent phase of use. They also they tried to stratify the cannabis that was used during this most consistent period in individuals who did use cannabis in terms of its potency. And the way they determined the potency of the use on the part of the individual was to ask them what was the colloquial name of the marijuana that they used. For instance, skunk or sensimilla, super skunk or French hashish, all were designations for high potency marijuana, as opposed to hash resin from the UK and Italy, or herbal cannabis or Brazilian marijuana and hash. And they had somehow determined ahead of time that the potency in those particular named kinds of marijuana was either high or either low. And so it was sort of self-report of the kind of cannabis that they were using. And apparently there's cannabis that you can get in the Netherlands that has THC content as high as 67%. Ooh. So what they did is they then inferred what the potency was, and they used a breakpoint of 10%. So if 10%, less than 10% would be considered low dose cannabis, and above 10% was high-dose cannabis. And they looked at a bunch of other covariates, including recreational drugs, tobacco, stimulants, ketamine use, hallucinogens, novel psychoactive substances they referred to, and I'm wondering if that was Tide tablets or Tide packets, which apparently is a means for getting high in some places.
I did not know that.
Yeah, apparently, and apparently quite dangerous too. And they did a sensitivity analysis that I don't think we need to get into, but they approached about 1,500 patients who had first psychosis. 23% refused, and they tended to be older women, white European older women. And they dropped a few of the sites because the data were poor or the enrollment was poor, and they ended up enrolling 901 individuals, which they say was broadly representative of all the patients, except that they tended to be a little bit younger than all of the patients that were in the overall study. And they enrolled about 1,100 population controls. And on table 1, they show us the comparison of a lot of the various characteristics of both the controls and the cases, and I was really struck by the amount of difference.
Yeah, really.
Between the
not comparable.
Not comparable in terms of gender, ethnicity, education, employment, lifetime cannabis or tobacco use, and other drug use.
Though not surprising. I mean, you would expect that in terms of their baseline characteristics, these groups would be quite different.
Yeah, it just seemed like they were more different in more categories than I actually expected.
Okay.
So they went through the analysis, and bottom line is that they found an adjusted odds ratio of first ever psychosis in terms of somebody who is a current user of cannabis, an adjusted odds ratio of 1.1. If the first use was below the age of 16, the odds ratio was 1.6. And if the use was daily, it went up to 3.2 odds ratio versus never or rarely using cannabis. And then when they looked at the potency, over 10% THC content, they found a 1.6 greater likelihood of having a first psychotic episode. And then they combined daily use and high potency, and the odds ratio went up to 4.8. They found that there was a lot of variation when they determined the population attributable fraction. They figured that assuming causality, which is a big assumption.
It's a big assumption.
A big assumption that if they could prevent cannabis use in Amsterdam, that they would get rid of about 44% of the cases of first psychosis that are seen in that town.
Which seems quite high to me, but
yeah, really high.
We could come back to that.
Yeah. So overall, the daily use of cannabis was associated with about a 3.2 times higher likelihood of having a first psychotic episode. And if you use highly potent marijuana, it was 1.6 times higher. And as I said, 4.8 times higher if you used actually both. And apparently, if you were a daily user of high potency marijuana and you live in Amsterdam, it's as high as 9 times higher likelihood of having a first psychotic episode.
Okay, so Chris, I'm going to come to you in a second, but I figured before I do that, it's worth mentioning that I think this is the first time we've done a case control study on the program. And by a case control study, we just mean a study in which first, well, it doesn't have to be done this way, but in this case, they identified cases of psychosis. So they identified people with the outcome. And then in a case control study, we then find a representative sample of the population that gave rise to that set of cases, which is difficult to do. But if we can get that representative sample, the sample is meant to tell us about the distribution of the exposure in the study base, so the exposure here being cannabis use. And we can, in theory, draw reasonable inferences about the effect of marijuana use on psychosis if we have done that well. We've identified the population reasonably well and sampled from them, and then dealt with all the other problems that we tend to run into observational studies like confounding and misclassification and all those things. So Chris, what was your feeling about this study?
Well, I don't think I'm going to surprise you, but I was not a super fan of the study, to be honest. And the reason why is a reason that I've stated on many occasions before, which is that I kind of find myself very frustrated with analyses that fundamentally don't really give me an answer to the question. And what I mean by that is that there are, as we all know, issues in terms of bias and causality that are associated with case control studies. And the kinds of issues that I can imagine that might lead to a false interpretation of these data are not resolved in this paper. And so I come away from reading it really not feeling much wiser than when I started as to which of these models is correct.
Fair, but can you give us a sense for specifically why? I mean, what are the issues that you're concerned about?
Okay, so let me start with the models, and then I'll sort of extend my argument further. So let's imagine that the first model is correct, which is that cannabis leads to psychotic disorder, which is in this case really a code word for schizophrenia, as it turns out. So we're going to say that smoking cannabis turns normal people into schizophrenics, or people with a psychotic state.
I just want to take issue with that because schizophrenia would be a diagnosis in which there are psychotic episodes, but you can have a psychotic episode, say, due to an organic brain syndrome that does not confer a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So I think you need to disentangle the two.
But let's stick with the starting point that the consumption of cannabis in some dose response way will lead to a psychotic disorder. So that's possibility number one. Possibility number two is that people who who have psychotic disorders already, possibly undiagnosed, are more likely to self-medicate and use cannabis because it has calming properties. And that wouldn't necessarily just be true for cannabis. There could be many drugs that would fall into that category, such as opiates or tobacco even, or alcohol. And we know that substance use is very common in patients with psychological disorders for precisely this reason, that they self-medicate.
I think that's a part of the, just to play the devil's advocate, I think that's part of the reason why they chose first psychotic episode.
Yeah, I understand that. And then the third one is that there could be some population of, patients who have maybe a low-level pre-existing psychotic disorder that is potentiated by the superimposition of these psychotropic drugs, because marijuana, THC is a hallucinogen. And so it could, exacerbate those pre-existing. So it's not really creating the disease, but it is unmasking the disease. Right. And so it's like leading to an accelerated rate of diagnosis, but it's not causal. No, so the authors talk then about how there's a dose-response relationship. And I would stipulate that the dose-response relationship doesn't actually clarify anything about which of these models would be preferred over the other. So I still don't know whether we are just unmasking disorders or if it's reverse causality because patients with psychotic disorder preferentially choose to use these medicines to self-medicate, or if it's a causal relationship. And so since I don't know the answer to that, I feel uninformed. And I would also kind of loop back to that issue about self-medication, because I wouldn't be surprised if you could do the same analysis and instead of like marijuana consumption, you could substitute opiate use. And nobody claims that opiates lead to psychotic disorders, but no one would be surprised to find that patients who have psychotic disorders often end up using opiates. Okay. The same thing with tobacco, the same thing with alcohol. In fact, if you substitute attendance at the Boston University Healthcare for the Homeless Clinic as an exposure, you would find that was highly correlated with psychotic disorder. And obviously that's absurd. It cannot be causal. And so if you just substitute the variable, I feel like we're stuck here and we still don't know from this paper which of these is likely to be the true case. And so I feel like I give a big shrug and say, I still don't know whether it causes anything.
I hear your point here. And I think that the part of the issue here is that the timing is so important. So it isn't that you could never tease out these relationships. You could, but you would need to know the timing of the marijuana use came before the first psychotic episode.
Right. And you're absolutely right, Matt.
As Don says, they limited this to first psychotic episode, but they were collecting the information on the exposure on the marijuana use retrospectively, if I understood correctly.
Yeah.
So you're asking people at the time of the psychotic disorder or after. I didn't
after
totally
the diagnosis has been made.
Right. And I would think that there would be recall bias potential there because you have those who have the psychotic disorder may remember their exposures to marijuana differently than those who don't have a psychotic disorder. You could also, social desirability bias, all kinds of reasons why you would misreport your cannabis use in a way that would lead to an increased association when maybe there isn't necessarily one. I will say, so Don and I checked it on this the other day, and we both kind of had the same reaction, which is that our priors on this were, some harmful effect. Mine was probably a small effect, but I kind of went into this thinking there may actually be one. But like you, Chris, I struggled to see this as strong evidence supporting my prior. That I think there was a lot in here that made me concerned that we may not actually be looking at a true effect. Now we may be. But the potential for the confounding, so that the issue that Don raised in the beginning, that these groups were pretty incomparable at baseline, or whatever we're defining baseline as, before the psychotic disorder diagnosis. And statistical models, you've got to deal with the measured confounding, but they were pretty rough measures of those confounders. So most of them were dichotomized ever or never type confounders, where it's really difficult to control that confounding. So I was left as well with a lot of questions about this.
Yeah.
Yeah, my prior was that there was going to be some association found, in part because there is a growing body of literature that seems to indicate that there are mental health effects of marijuana use and of chronic marijuana use, and I think in particular in young adolescents there are some pretty disturbing effects that have been found with marijuana use, and so it doesn't come as a surprise. All the caveats that you point out, Chris, I completely agree with. Although the third category that you pose, which is that this is an unmasking, I think is perfectly consistent with what the authors are trying to drive at. I mean, it's not that marijuana causes somebody who has no propensity to develop psychosis, but rather it's an enabling factor. And that, in fact, in the absence of marijuana, the question, which is not answered by this study, is would it have developed anyway, or would it not have developed anyway in that individual with an underlying propensity who didn't smoke marijuana? And so it could still, if that is in fact true, there could be still some, and it is borne out by stronger research over time, it could have some beneficial public health effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am not arguing in any way that the data in this paper refute the possibility that there's a causal relationship. My beef with this, if you will, is that the methodology doesn't allow us to make that call. And we're still like wondering at the end of the paper, well, is it causal or is it coincidental?
So not a nail in the coffin, but maybe a little tiny thumbtack.
As with you and Matt, if you'd asked me my prior before this, I would say, you betcha there's going to be an association.
Yeah.
But I still don't know whether it's a causal association. That's the tricky part here. I'm willing to believe there could be. I just don't find that the paper persuaded me that we know much more than we did before.
Sure.
Other than that the two of them hang together.
I got to say, consuming marijuana with a 67% THC content,
Daily.
I would find it hard to imagine that anybody wouldn't get psychotic with that high a level of essentially a very psychoactive substance.
Yeah.
That's really high.
That's really high. Because I think like marijuana that they sell in the state here for medical marijuana is like in the 20 to 25% THC range.
Even that high?
Which is even pretty high already. That's quite potent stuff. So 60%, that's astonishing.
So one of the, not to change the subject, but one of the questions that this study sort of raised for me is that I was very confused. So if you go back and read the title of this study, the title of the study does not say anything about causation, right? The contribution of cannabis use to variation in incidence. Okay, contribution, maybe, but they're really just talking about variation. Then in the manuscript, they vacillate back and forth between using causal language and predictive language. Their main conclusion is our main findings show that among the measures of cannabis use tested, the strongest independent predictors of whether an individual could have a psychotic disorder, blah, blah, blah. So there we're using the language of prediction, not the language of causation. And then they get into the population attributable fraction analysis where they say, okay, if we can assume this is causal, and it gets very confusing. And so the question that it raised for me was, when is it okay to use what I think of as poorly specified exposures and then try to make causal statements from data? Let's assume none of the problems that we've already talked about existed. And the simple problem was, what's the hypothesis? Is the hypothesis that you smoke marijuana once and suddenly your risk for developing psychosis goes up? Is it, a certain amount over a certain period of time? And the way this plays out to me, where it gets the least clear is, and I don't want to imply that the authors put any stock into this, but it's in there, is that one of their exposures was spending $20 on marijuana. Spending $20 on marijuana is a very poorly defined exposure, right?
I don't know how much $20 would buy you.
Especially,
I don't either.
Especially as expressed in euros, because it was 20
Probably
euros,
not
I think.
that much.
Was it 20 euros? Sorry,
yeah.
20 euros or whatever it was, 20 euros. You wouldn't do a randomized trial of spend 20 euros on marijuana, right?
And see who becomes psychotic.
Yeah, I mean it's an incredibly poorly defined exposure that you would, and I hate to always refer back to trials, but for me trials are the way to think through, how you're setting up your study. Is it valid? You would never do that, and I think you could make a case that much of the exposures in this study are fairly poorly defined, even though they veer into the direction of exposures that I think make more sense, like a certain amount of marijuana over a certain period of time. And it's I don't know what to say about that beyond I find it frustrating.
I sort of had a similar beef when the authors start making the argument that there appears to be a correlation across cities and study sites in terms of crude incidence of psychosis, or really overall psychosis, where London has high daily use and the incidence of psychosis is 45 cases per 100,000. Amsterdam also has high, but not quite as high as London, and their incidence of psychosis is 38 cases. And then Bologna has very low use of cannabis, and their incidence of psychosis is less, at 21 cases per 100,000. I thought that was really torturing the data.
Yeah, I agree with you. And to get back to your issue about the language, Matt, I guess I would have preferred that they didn't use the population attributable fraction at all, because it feels like it's just making an assumption that goes way beyond what is fair here. Yeah. And it is misleading. And clearly the media reports that you described at the beginning, a number of them picked up on that and ran with it. So,
but I mean, even the authors say assuming causality, which is a huge assumption.
It's a huge assumption. Right. But once you state it, like you say, well, maybe we should assume causality. I mean, it's out there, and now it kind of it lends itself credibility just by being stated.
Yep. A couple of last things that I just wanted to point out. So I described the case control study in the beginning, and I said the key assumption is that the controls that are representative of the exposure distribution in the base, that they represent the population that gave rise to these cases. And the question we tend to ask when we have a sample of cases is, who are the people who, if they had developed psychosis, would have made it into this study? And I'm not sure that the population that they use as controls is really representative of that population. So my understanding of their control selection was that controls are sampled mostly using random sampling from lists of postal addresses and also from GP lists. And I'm not sure that that's the population that necessarily would end up in with a diagnosis if they had developed one. In addition, they excluded controls if they had ever received a diagnosis of or treatment for psychotic disorder. And I know many people think that is the right thing to do, but we don't do that. In a case control study, we don't exclude people who were cases as controls or potential cases as controls. It's probably not that big of a deal because it's probably not that common of an outcome, but it's not what we should be doing in case control studies.
Is that because in this instance they wanted, this is not a cohort study, so they weren't really looking at effects over time. They were measuring the exposure retroactively. But if they had had a previous diagnosis of psychotic disorder 10 years ago, and then the marijuana use occurred subsequent to that, that would clearly violate all assumptions of causality.
So that would be true, but the point of the controls here is to get the exposure distribution in the population that gave rise to the cases. So you're right, in terms of the timing, you'd still want to get the timing right. But I still don't think it would make sense to exclude the cases or potential cases as controls. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Any last points anyone wants to raise before we move on?
Yeah, just sort of in support of your line of thinking, Matt. I think it struck me that the age difference was really quite large, and we know that
between the cases and the non-cases,
cases and not cases, and the authors themselves admitted that they had underrepresented populations that they needed to reach out and try to augment in their enrollment, and that was young men. And we know that schizophrenia and psychosis the onset tends to be in younger people. It tends to be in the late teens and the early 20s. So I mean, I think that's something that sort of underscores what you were saying, Matt.
Yeah. Okay. So I think in summary, we're all open to the hypothesis, but are not yet convinced by this data, or at least we think there's enough potential for bias in this that we're not swayed for sure. Yeah. A couple last things. So once again, I looked at the introduction to this, and it's again really short, 241 words. And I wanted to relay my recent experience with one of so this was in the Lancet Psychology, Lancet
Psychiatry, I think.
Yeah. So I had an experience recently with one of the Lancet journals in which we submitted a paper, we got comments back, and we then responded to the comments. But now, as happens when you do this, you respond to the comments and you have to make the paper longer. And so they came back to us and said, obviously you need to shorten the paper. And one of the ways they suggested doing that was by making the introduction shorter. So I think that's actually it may be by design. It may not be that I keep noticing all these short introductions, that essentially they want to keep the introduction short and focus on the the details in the discussion. Anyway. All right, so let's move on. So in our second segment, we want to talk about something that, as I mentioned in the intro, I'd never really heard of this before. It's something called ethics dumping. And this was inspired by an article that Don found in, I believe it was in The Economist. The article was entitled "Recent Events Highlight an Unpleasant Scientific Practice, Ethics Dumping" by, I don't know, because I couldn't find a byline on this. I don't know if you guys could, but I couldn't.
The Economist never has bylines.
Oh, it doesn't?
No.
Okay, well then it's by The Economist.
Yeah.
So the article, it begins by talking about the recent scandal in China dealing with the editing of the genomes of 2 embryos that are now baby girls, and the reaction of many who thought of this as a particularly problematic event conducted in a place with lax enforcement. I'm quoting here from the study a bit, from the article a bit. And the basic argument that they made in this Economist piece was that this may be part of a larger phenomenon called ethics dumping. And so now I'm actually quoting from the article. They say ethics dumping is the carrying out by researchers from one country, usually rich and with strict regulations, in another, usually less well off and with laxer laws, of an experiment that would not be permitted at home, or of one that might be permitted, but in a way that would be frowned upon. And so the idea here is that if you go back to the Chinese experiment that I just talked about, they say the suggestion in this case is that the doctor involved in the experiment, who led the experiment,
Dr. He.
Dr. He, was encouraged and assisted in his project by a researcher at an American university. So this person was Dr. He's mentor and had been on publications with the same doctor as the one who had carried out the research, and supposedly was on a paper that was submitted to Nature describing this particular work, the embryo manipulation, before it was rejected and came out into the public. And so the idea here is that there are folks there may be people in these countries where ethical regulations would prevent doing certain research. So you find people in a country with lax laws and you encourage them or work with them or help them somehow, not by directly participating, but by condoning and supporting the work. And therefore it gets done, but you are not directly involved. And they refer to this as ethics dumping. Now they say in this article that there were a dozen similar cases in Asia and Africa that came out in a book published by a group called Trust, called Ethics Dumping, Case Studies from North-South Research Collaborations. They give some examples of these in Indian trials and other places. One of the examples they give hit a little close to home. They talked about the efficacy of cheap cervical cancer screening methods, which would require control groups, which in the United States would be composed of women undergoing an established screening procedure. But in the Indian trials, the controls, a total of 141,000 women, were not offered pap smears that were the supposed gold standard in certainly in the US, and they say in India at that time. Anyway, so the article goes on to describe a number of these cases, and reading this article kind of disturbed me, because when you follow it through to its most horrific ends, some of these things are very clearly disturbing. The editing of embryos, or some examples Don might want to mention, are pretty clear violations of what I think would be ethically feasible. What I get concerned about is where the line is on these things. So when is it okay to be involved in research that might not be appropriate in one country, but would be appropriate in another if you are a researcher from the country where it's not appropriate. Yeah. And I wonder what you all think of this, or the larger concept in general.
So to me, it feels like a lot of this sort of comes down to the common rule about the ethical conduct of
which is
research. So there are 5 pieces of the common rule, so 5 central pieces. And the first one is the most relevant here, which is that the risk of the experiment must be reasonable and it must be minimized relative to the benefits. And so right away we run into a problem here where the 2 baby girls in question had their embryos, were edited in the embryo stage to render them resistant to HIV. Now, that's a it's seemingly a noble thing to do, but at the same time, it invites all sorts of potential risks. And in fact, the risks cannot be known even, within the first few years. The downstream effects of having the genome, the germline genome of these children manipulated is something that we may not know for a decade or two. Down the line. Plus, the fact is that these girls have now had a permanent change made to their germline DNA, and so this trait that has been edited into them is itself heritable. Okay, so Dr. He has made a decision that now passes on and on and on through all the ancestors of this child in perpetuity, and without any understanding of what the potential risks of that were, and the putative benefit of it. It was totally implausible because these children were not at risk of getting HIV peripartum. So
hang on a second, but so I think we all agree that this was highly unethical. But that isn't the question I think that we want to focus on here, which is the question of whether or not this research was encouraged by people in high income countries, in the US in this case, and whether there are ever cases where that would be justified.
So I mean, I guess the answer is yes. That there are times, say, in the development of a new vaccine that might have benefits in the United States, but might also have benefits outside of the United States. The one that comes to mind recently is Group B strep, which is a common cause of sepsis in neonates and sometimes in the mothers as well. So the incidence of Group B strep sepsis in the United States is relatively low because our existing public health screening and prophylaxis strategy is quite comprehensive and quite effective. And so it's difficult to do those studies here in the United States because it's hard to accumulate the number of events. But ultimately, one would like to license that vaccine in the United States. However, it is also true that Group B strep is a huge problem in the developing world. And so many of the Group B strep trials have been done outside of the United States because the higher event rate exists outside of the United States. And so this is this seems like a very gray zone to me.
Well, I think we've to a certain extent, we've lived through this with HIV. Matt and I were talking, and previously it was a huge issue when a course of antiretroviral medication would cost $17,000 a year, and to then be taking the efficacy trials of those medications to places where they're in incredible need, like Africa, posed a real ethical problem if, in fact, you couldn't guarantee, it was hard to imagine that you could guarantee a lifelong supply for those individuals who were being treated with a very effective medication that cost $17,000 a year. And so it was something that the HIV research world went through a lot of soul searching about. And I think, Matt, when you and I were talking about this, your issue was that, at the time it appeared to be unethical, but what has subsequently happened, and probably wouldn't have happened if we hadn't done that, is that the cost of those medications are now about $150 a year, and millions of people's lives have been saved as a result. So I agree, Chris, this is a sort of a gray area.
It's very tricky.
For that it is. For this particular case, for Dr. He, it's not
at all.
And the other case that they cite in this article is the case of head transplantation, and
he's not kidding about that.
Which
he's not kidding about that.
Freaks me out.
Right.
Go ahead.
No, so apparently there's an Italian neurosurgeon who has shown in animal models that reconnecting the spinal cord can be done in what appears, using very soft evidence, appears to be successful. And he has found a researcher in the developing world who is also, I believe, a neurosurgeon, and they have actually found an individual who was a quadriplegic who said that they wanted to be the first individual who would be the subject of a head transplantation.
So they're going to decapitate this guy and then try to attach a new head to him?
Correct.
Wow.
It ended up that he changed his mind because he
the researcher or he the
I'm sorry,
patient?
the patient changed his mind and doesn't want to agree to do it because he ended up having a child, and that sort of changed his whole perspective on it.
Well, sure, and the probability of death would be close to 100%.
One would think.
Yeah.
One would think.
So
I mean, that is an extreme example of ethics dumping.
there was another example that has a number of similar elements, but which was this live attenuated herpes vaccine developed by this Dr. William Halford at the University of Southern Illinois or something like that. And he chose to test this outside the United States in St. Kitts and Nevis. And he would fly U.S. citizens, test subjects, down to Nevis to be vaccinated, down to St. Kitts, to be vaccinated. And they did this almost entirely to avoid FDA oversight and to not have to go through an IRB. And of course, they didn't notify the health authorities in St. Kitts. So it's not quite the same, because it's not like they were looking for a lower level of ethical standards in which to conduct their trial. They were just looking for a place where the local health authorities probably didn't have the resources to do oversight, and so they could get away with it. But this was really, monstrous, and there was almost no safety monitoring of these patients at all, and a number of them had very severe outbreaks of herpes simplex, after receiving, their second dose of the vaccine. So, and there was no physician oversight on site during the administration of these vaccinations. So it checked off almost every do not do box on the list of ethical behavior in research.
Yeah.
I do think that the article where I thought it fell down a little bit was not clearly making the distinction between ethics dumping and just poor ethical behavior. So, as best I could understand it, and maybe I just didn't understand it well enough, the example that they used of the pap smear was just unethical. It wasn't that it would have been ethical. They moved the study to India because it would have been ethical there and not ethical in the U.S. It sounds like, from what I was reading, it would be unethical in both places.
Yeah.
And so, ethics dumping is the concept that you are shifting the research to a place where it would be seen as ethical, or at least you could get away with it, but is still encouraged by those in places where it would be considered unethical. And I think a distinction does need to be made. All right. Any last points anyone wants to make about ethics dumping?
I think we should not do it.
Great point, Chris. Really, really helpful. It's nice that our listeners got a really good, concise summary and a nice take-home message. So well done for that.
It's a bad thing to do. Don't do that.
It is a bad thing to do. Please don't do it. Okay, so let's go on to our last segment, which is our amazing and amusing. And I, as mentioned on our last podcast, feel the amazing and amusing no longer needs an introduction. So let's just jump right into it. And I'm going to take the prerogative to go first this time. So there is another podcast out there. You guys may be surprised to learn we're not the only podcast in the world.
We're the only really excellent podcast.
Oh, okay. So there's another podcast that I do enjoy called Everything Hurts. I've mentioned it on the podcast before. It's run by two guys, one of whom is at Northeastern, right down the road, a guy named James Heathers. And James Heathers was also instrumental in, so remember earlier we talked about the Brian Wansing studies, the nutrition studies that had all kinds of problems, and a bunch of clever researchers unearthed all these problems, and eventually most of those studies were actually retracted. He was one of them.
He was one of the guys who pinned it on him, you mean? Not one of the...
Yeah. He was one of the guys who outed all these problems. Well, James Heathers is also a very amusing person, and he is joined Twitter, and he's got fantastic Twitter postings. And I didn't get a chance to look up. I will do it while I'm speaking, but it looks like he has about 6,800 Twitter followers. Okay. Now, just about a month ago, I would say, he launched a new Twitter handle, which now has 55,000 followers, despite the fact that it has only been in existence for a short period of time and has only put out 69 tweets.
Wow.
And the Twitter handle is at Just Sayin' Mice.
Just saying mice?
Just say
Mice.
in mice.
Oh.
Or actually just says in mice, but just says in mice. And the entire Twitter handle, he just puts out articles that come out in the popular press that, claim some big claims. So just looking at one of them on here. So, things like stop drinking protein shakes, beverages may lead to weight gain, depression, and shorter lifespans, and things like that. And then he just tweets out, in mice, because all these studies were done in mice.
Seriously.
That's awesome.
A new drug could let us eat anything without gaining weight. In mice.
And these are all mice experiments. There are no human studies at all.
No human, and yet they get huge headlines of all these different things.
Wow.
And so
And he's got
he's just put together this website,
55,000 followers. That's great.
tweeting out.
That's beautiful.
Good
for him. Good for him. That's hysterical.
In mice. So you should all go follow.
Is it like hashtag
Twitter handle.
in mice or something? Or
No. It's just it's a Twitter handle at just says in mice. Just says in mice.
Beautiful.
Oh, that's
Good
great.
for him.
That's
Very
fantastic.
creative. I love that.
All right, Chris, what do you got?
Well, I'm going to segue right off of that because part of what I'm going to talk about is the naked mole rat, which is not a mouse.
Oh, fantastic.
But the naked mole rats, I really wanted to make the title of this little wacky and weird. What do E. coli, naked mole rats, and elephants have in common? But at first, I'm going to talk about naked mole rats because I didn't know anything about naked mole rats until I read this paper. And I was like, wow, these sound like really fascinating creatures. And so I'll just rattle off a couple factoids about naked mole rats, which I bet you did not know. So number one,
I don't know anything about them. So
they and one other species are the only true eusocial mammals on Earth. Meaning, eusocial means that their society is hive-like, that there is a queen and there are drones and most of the workers are sterile. And the naked mole rat colonies behave just like bees or ants, where there's one reproductive, female, and then when she dies, there's a group of sterile females who suddenly become sexually mature and they fight it out and become the new queen. It's just it's so weird.
Sounds like a cult.
It's like a cult, yeah. And so
I did not know that, though. I will agree.
Second fun fact is, in addition to being naked, they have no pain. They have their substance P reception is totally different, and they don't have nociceptors.
Really?
They don't. Yeah.
So you can't torture a mole
So
rat.
you can't torture. They have no sense of pain when you pierce their skin, which is weird. Third thing is they're isothermic, so they are non-warm-blooded mammals.
But they're not poikilotherms.
No,
I don't even know what you just said.
Might be. I'm not sure.
Cold-blooded.
They're not cold-blooded
Like
because
reptiles.
they do regulate their temperature, but they do it behaviorally, either by huddling in their den or by going
shivering?
up and down the elevator, so to speak, of their burrows, which can go very deep into the ground in Africa. They live in Africa. And so when they're cold, they go out to where it's warm. When they're warm, they go down to where it's cooler. And so they may regulate just by vertical migration in the burrow. The fourth thing is that they live about 30 years, which is like Methuselah rodents, which is incredible. And they have an incredible tolerance for anoxia because they live in this the hypoxic environment deep in the ground all the time, and they can actually survive for 18 minutes. Has been documented in a zero oxygen environment without brain death, and they do this by basically shutting down their metabolism and going dormant. So they are incredible animals.
God, they would be good pearl divers.
And the burrows of these naked mole rat colonies can extend for 3 or 4 kilometers underground.
Wow.
So they spend their entire lives, they're basically blind underground. And the last thing, which is what is the important thing, is that they have an incredibly low cancer rate, which is what I was going to talk about, because I ran across this cool paper in PNAS about the pedo paradox. So Richard Pedo was this epidemiologist who made this sort of funny thought experiment that basically stating that anytime a cell reproduces, there is a potential, divides, that there's a potential for a mutation to occur that would lead to cancer, right? Just because of random errors over time. And so the bigger the animal, you would predict, the higher the cancer rates of the animal. Because an elephant's cells are no bigger than ours. They just have more of them. A blue whale has more cells than we do. They're not bigger cells. And so there's just you would think that blue whales and elephants would be riddled with cancer, but they're not. And the paradox is not really a paradox because, of course, if that were true, the elephants would all be dead of cancer. They couldn't possibly survive. And so the paradox is that there must be a way that the elephants have figured out a strategy genetically for not getting cancer. And so there's been a lot of research into this recently, and it turns out indeed that there are all sorts of very clever genetic mechanisms that lead to this. Now, one of them is through this protein called tumor protein 53. And I don't know exactly what it does.
One of my favorites.
TP53, right. One thing it does is it senses major errors in DNA, like a big mutation, and then it triggers apoptosis so that the cell dies. Now, we humans have like one copy of the TP53 gene in our body. And if that gene is mutated, that has a name. It's called the Li-Fraumeni syndrome. And everyone who has Li-Fraumeni, 100% will eventually develop cancer if they live long enough. Elephants have like 20 copies of the TP53 gene. And so they're doing apoptosis constantly. And it turns out that lots of other animals have different strategies for doing this too, including the naked mole rats. And they use a strategy like E. coli, which is quorum sensing. So that as they get to a certain size and their cells start to cluster together, they have this tremendous inhibition to cell growth, and so they do not develop cancer. It's occasionally they do, but it's very, very, very rare. So it was sort of like an interesting experiment in like how very large animals get around the hazard of having too many cells around.
Did you know that bats don't get cancer either?
Yeah, and some of them do the same thing.
They thermoregulate by they apparently can induce a fever through flying. And part of the immune mechanism in bats that protects them from cancer also makes them an incredibly good reservoir for exotic viruses.
Wow. I didn't know that,
Yeah.
but that kind of feels like it makes sense.
Yeah, kind of it's consistent with what you're saying.
Another cool thing about the naked mole rats is, and there's so many cool
Obviously, there's more.
things. But a couple episoappends ago, we
I
did
think we should have them for pets. Wouldn't that be cool?
Let's do
these
a
things
mole
are
rat episode.
so
Cuddly.
appallingly ugly animals.
But they like to cuddle.
They do, but it's good that they're blind because they're not attractive creatures.
All right, we're running out of time.
All right,
here, Chris.
I'll wrap it up. But the naked mole rats
We just
also
hit the 2-hour mark.
have like a checkpoint inhibition, so that their immune regulation of tumor cells is ramped up like way high.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's how they live 35 years without
wow.
getting cancer. It's like that pembrolizumab
Is that a serious
drug.
wow?
All right, so I'm done. Yeah.
All right,
moving on.
So I'm gonna raise
Done. Go for it.
I'm gonna raise the level of discourse like I am
Excellent.
wont to do
That's
by
what we
citing
expect from you.
by citing a study that was cited again in The Economist, one of my favorite sources,
Notably funny journal.
notably hysterical journal. It was they're citing a paper that was done by John Jerem, Phil Parker, and Nika Shur that appeared in the Institute of Labor Economics. And the title of the article in The Economist is "Who are the biggest bullshitters?" And apparently, what they did was they had an
BSers?
BSers, yeah. They deployed an educational survey to 40,000 teenage students in 9 English-speaking countries to find out who is the most likely to spout nonsense. They inserted a section into the questionnaire which asked students how well they understood a collection of 16 mathematical concepts. Some were familiar, such as polygon and probability, but 3 were false: proper number, subjunctive scaling, and declarative fraction.
They don't sound pretty plausible.
But they mean nothing. And so then they determined which students by gender and from which countries tended to claim that they knew what those concepts were.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And predict.
Oh, I have to say, if I had taken this test, I would have said yes. Of course I know what that is.
So of the following countries, which do you think were at the top of the list, meaning that they had the highest frequency of BSers and the lowest? So we have Australia, New Zealand, England, United States, Canada, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. So who was at the top?
I'm going to say the U.S.
Yeah, I would have said the US too.
No, it was Canada.
Really?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and the United States was second. And who was the last?
New Zealand?
Scotland.
Scotland.
Yeah, apparently they are just extremely truthful and they don't BS much at all.
Well, that's because they've only got sheep.
What about the difference between boys and girls? Were boys more likely to be BSers?
Boys. Yes, boys.
Yes, by a lot, actually. And what about rich and poor?
Rich.
Yes.
Rich.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
That's like reverse causality, though.
Yeah.
That's how they got rich.
Oh yeah, because you got money. You got to sound like you know everything.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Isn't that great?
That is a beautiful study.
The news will shock nobody. In every country, men claim to be experts more often than women. The rich were more
of course.
boastful than the poor. More surprising was the finding that immigrants were generally more likely to bluff about math than native students were.
Oh, interesting. Well done. All right. Well,
I'm suddenly feeling very awkward.
isn't that what this podcast is?
What was my last egregious mansplaining moment? It's probably this morning when I was talking to my wife and she drove away in her car fast without letting me finish what I was saying.
That happens a
right.
lot, doesn't it?
It seems to. Oh dear.
All right. Well, that is the end of our program. If you got any feedback or this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study for us or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at @PopHealthEX, or you can tweet me at @ProfMattFox, or Chris at id.gill, or Don at dthea1, or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website. That's www.pophealthex.org. We'd like to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you download our next episode.